As the Texas Tech University Board of Regents continues its search for a new system chancellor, the Texas Tribune is reporting two top contenders.
Lubbock Congressman Jody Arrington and Texas State Senator Brandon Creighton are reportedly the two candidates in the running to replace Dr. Ted Mitchell as chancellor. Arrington has represented the Lubbock Congressional District since 2016, is a Tech alum, and at one time served as the vice chancellor of the university. He is now chairman of the House Budget Committee and is credited with carrying President Trump's big, beautiful bill to passage.
Creighton represents Conroe in the state Senate, a position he has held since 2014. He has carried a majority of the education bills passed by the legislature in recent years, including school vouchers and the ban on diversity, equity, and inclusion offices at public colleges and universities. The Board of Regents plans to meet again Saturday and is expected to provide an update on its search process.